On Saturday, the 3rd of June, we're having our famous Word in the Park in the splendid surroundings of Holland Park, Kensington. Our guests that day include Bob Stanley, who'll be talking about the Bee Gees, Leslie Ann Jones, whose specialist subject is the Rolling Stones, and John Higgs, who'll be explaining what the Beatles and James Bond tell us about the British psyche. Your hosts will be me, David Hepworth, and Mark Ellen. There will be a canopy over your head, there are cold drinks and spectacular lavatories. It starts at 2 and finishes at 4:30. Get your tickets here. Right, welcome to another Word in Your Ear, where our guest is a man you well know, without sounding like something from The Simpsons. You probably know him from such sensations as Split Enz, Crowded House, The Finn Brothers, but also as Tim Finn. And also here to talk about all kinds of things, including his new record with Andy White, which resumes a partnership which started many, many years ago. Hello, Tim. How you doing?
Greetings.
Hello, guys. Very good to see you. Thanks for having me on the show.
So you're in New Zealand at the moment?
Yes, we're in New Zealand, where it's autumnal now. We're getting a little chill in the evenings, but beautiful, clear days. And it's Good Friday, of course. So the moon is just about full for Easter, which is a lovely time of year.
Absolutely.
And I think you were saying that's a wooden house, isn't it? A very old, by New Zealand standards, a very old wooden house, and has fantastic acoustics for recording.
It is. It's great. Our music always sounds so good in a wooden room or a wooden house. You know, there's a resonance there you can't get anywhere any other way. And we've got some lovely old pianos here and acoustic guitars and things, and they all just sound great here. So I recorded a lot of the tracks that I played on the Andy White, Tim Finn record here in this room and in other parts of the house. And John Lickie was good enough to mix it all for us. But yeah, we sent him some nice, lovely natural sounds.
Good. So what we traditionally do is we start by asking people if they can remember what record playing machinery was in their home when they were a child.
Well, we had I guess it was pretty standard record player, which was just a box, really, like a small kind of box. It must have had a couple of speakers in it, almost like a small suitcase, and you'd lift the lid up and there was the record player. And it was fine because we didn't know any better. The best people could do in those days was probably having like a stereogram or a radiogram or something like that. It was a bigger piece of furniture, didn't necessarily sound any better. And I just remember I always used to turn the bass up full, treble right off. So I used to like getting some bass into the sound. That was what I was I guess it was a visceral kind of reaction to music. I wanted to feel it, And these things were pretty tinny, so you had to really help them along.
And what were the first things you can remember playing in the family home? You got two sisters, I think, and your brother Neil. I mean, were they the sisters older than you? Was it some of their music?
One sister is older, and the other sister is younger, and Neil's younger, of course. I mean, so I started consciously being aware of music probably when I was about 9 or 10 in terms of records and radio play. But prior to that, there'd been a lot of music in the house. Because Mum was Irish, and so the idea of people singing in the home when friends came around or relatives, there'd usually be some sort of circle would be drawn, and then people would sing a song. And so whether or not it was with piano accompaniment or just a cappella, we got used to the idea, Neil and I and our sisters, of just music being part of life and being played naturally and organically in the room. And then I became aware of records, and I remember the very first time I just stopped still and listened to something, and I don't remember the year it came out, but I was born in 52, so it was probably late 50s, and it was Eddie Cochran singing "I'm Gonna Knock on Your Door," I'm gonna knock on your door, ring on your bell, tap on your windowsill, etc., etc. And it was a silly little song, but it was something about the adenoidal quality of his voice that I really related to. He sounded like me, or it sounded like somebody really young. And I stood in somebody's kitchen. I can remember that moment. And then after that, there was another song called "Sailor," which was a big hit in America. Started out as a German song, all about a young woman, singing to her sailor boy who was out on the sea. And it just something about, there was a spoken section in that where she was sort of calling to him, and the yearning and quality of her voice. I've been trying to capture that ever since, I think. Because you got to have a bit of yearning in your pop music,
But you never had any self-consciousness about performance, presumably, because of that family tradition of always.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I actually did. I wasn't a natural performer myself. I like to listen and watch, but I had to be dragged out of the furthest room away, to come and sing. And then I would sing, and I'd be glad I did, but I wasn't like dying for it, and I didn't. You're right. There's a sort of a paradox in what I've just said, because on the one hand, it was very natural, and there's Uncle George singing Shake Hands with a Millionaire, and there's Peggy Dawson singing Stormy Weather, and it happens all the time, same songs. What would be more natural than to step up and sing? But I didn't feel that. I was very self-conscious at first.
Right. When did you first perform in public? Can you remember?
Well, in public, I think it was at school. I was at boarding school for a while in Auckland, and the Beatles came along and sort of changed my world completely. They arrived in New Zealand at the same time that black and white television did. It was probably the same for some parts of England, although you were probably onto television earlier than us. So this would have been about 1963. And so there were the Beatles on TV, on the news, and there was their music on this little record player. And I think Beatles for Sale was the first album we bought, although they'd had a couple out by then. Maybe they'd only had the first one, Please Please Me. What was it called? Beatles?
Please Please Me was the first one.
Yeah. So Beatles for Sale would have been the second album, possibly.
Well, it might have been in New Zealand. I don't know. It's about the fourth in.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Right. Might have got a bit mixed up down there. The releases were staggered, weren't they? In America as well, that was happening.
Yeah.
But they came to New Zealand into Wellington, didn't they? In 64?
Yeah, they did. They toured New Zealand.
You didn't get to see them, did you?
No, and that's shows you what the times were like, because I think I would have been about 12 or so, and I would have begged, if I'd thought it was actually remotely possible, that I would travel 100 miles from where we lived to Auckland. But it was like going to the moon in some ways, until I got a bit older and realised it was only a 2-hour car trip. And so I didn't even ask, and I missed it. And so I do regret that, although I don't know what I would have remembered or what I would have taken away from it. The records were more than enough at that point, and buying the sheet music and learning to play some of the songs.
Right. Was it hard to get records?
Yeah, it was, but we weren't, diligently pursuing a kind of big record collection or anything. I mean, it was just every one that came into the house seemed to have a bit of magic about it. So we probably only had about a dozen records, and Dad had about another dozen of big band swing music that he was passionate about. He had all the best artists from that era, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald. He loved Gene Krupa, and he loved, so the whole, he was far more than any of his friends. He was totally into music, although he wasn't musical himself. He didn't play any instruments or sing much.
You're saying you had about a dozen records. Can you remember what any of those were then?
Well, every Beatles record after the one I've mentioned we would get. The Bee Gees, the earliest Bee Gees records, because I really like that song, To Love Somebody, and Words.
Yeah.
And so whatever their first album or two were. We had a Christmas record of Bing Crosby's. We had the soundtrack to My Fair Lady. We had, nothing particularly, we didn't have a diverse collection of pop music. It was very Beatles-centric, and that sort of carried on a bit. And we all remember those days when, it seemed like this in New Zealand, it was pretty tribal. You were either into the Beatles or you're into the Stones. And then there were a lot of offshoots of both sides of that equation. So, I got into the Move and the Kinks and bands like that pretty soon after that period, when I was probably at boarding school, 14, 15, 16 years of age.
So what was the New Zealand music scene like? The kind of homegrown music in those days?
Well, I mean, we used to go to, when I was pretty young, we'd go to, they'd have these kind of shows at the beach we went to, like Talent Quest, and then there'd be like a Maori show band, Howard Morrison's quartet, which I guess they were doing a take on the Ink Spots and the Drifters, but we didn't know any better. We just thought that was completely original and amazing, those 4-part harmonies with acoustic guitar and drums and bass. There were bands that were starting to come up around the 60s. I mean, there was a band called Larry's Rebels that had a couple of good singles. It's very hard to remember. There were bands that would play at the dance. They'd have these dances. That was the only way that young people could sort of get together, was to go to a dance. And they were horrifying affairs. All the guys would stand down one side of the room and all the girls would stand down the other side of the room, and to actually cross over was just a huge kind of thing, you know.
It was like the demilitarized zone, wasn't it? It was like North and South Korea.
And bands
and the
would play,
fear of rejection.
Yeah. And my friends would go up to the band and they go, "We've got a cousin or a friend who can sing. Can he get up?" And so they'd push me up and I'd sing. Usually I'd sing "To Love Somebody." That seemed to be my party piece. But the band would sort of stand there backing me, you know, and they probably thought it was all right, you know, and would go down pretty well. But that was, I don't know, when I think of it, because I was pretty shy and not a natural performer, as I say, I'm amazed I even did it, you know. But that gave me a taste for singing into a microphone and feeling that sound kind of go out. It was pretty magical.
Right, right.
When did you first sort of form a group then? How old were you then?
I was at school, probably fourth form, so I would have been 14 or 15, and my best friend and I formed sort of a group and learned to play songs at the same time. So we'd learn E minor and G and D and A, you know, those chords that they can actually take you very far. They're still quite productive chords.
Oh yeah, an entire set there, many times over.
Exactly.
What were you playing? What covers were you playing?
Oh, Beatles songs, Bee Gees songs, you know, pretty much.
Right, right.
A few others that we learned, I suppose. Hard to remember now.
So where does Split Enz come along? Where does that?
We formed in 1972, and so that's what people think of Split Enz sometimes as being an 80s band, but we were actually a 70s band. And we drew from the 60s. So in a way, New Zealand in 1972 was having its kind of 1968, 69 moment.
Yeah.
And, you know, bands were springing up all over the place. And we formed our band at school and played a couple of shows at school. And we had a very enabling brother. It was a Catholic school. There were Morris brothers were teaching us, who allowed us to bring the organ over from the chapel. And it was just an old harmonium pump organ, pretty heavy. About 6 or 8 of us would lug it across into the assembly hall. We'd hold a little show there. And the organ was perfect for learning things like Procol Harum's Whiter Shade of Pale.
Yes, it would be, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And there was another song called Homburg that we learned.
The follow-up, yes.
Yeah. And you know, then one of the band was Into the Cream, and so we'd learn one of theirs, and et cetera, et cetera. It was great, actually, because and boarding school was pretty grim, you know. Everything was bad about it. Except that you could have a lot of fun because it was us versus them 24/7, you know. And there was a lot of humor to be had in having an enemy that was so clearly delineated, who would actually be hitting us with sticks and things, you know. So it was good fun, and doing the concerts was a great release, and it was brilliant, you know.
So when did you come to the UK for the first time?
We came to England first time in 76. So we went to Australia first in 75. Those first 3 years, 72 to 75, were we'd only do a show every month or so. We didn't want to go professional in New Zealand because it meant we would have had to play in the pubs, and we didn't want to play the pubs because we wanted to make it feel like a concert every time with a piano and an organ, or, you know, we eventually got a mellotron sent out from England, which was an extraordinary moment. I remember I flew down to this town where they'd imported this mellotron and then flew back with it on the plane in luggage, and then took it into the band. Everybody stood around it like as if it was a flying saucer, you know. And we played a chord on it. It was just like a moment in time I'll never forget. So we had a mellotron and things like that, which you can't take those in the pubs, and you can't take them on tour. They're like a bit of furniture, really, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Must have cost a fortune, a mellotron, mustn't it?
It was $1,200, which in those days, we'd only just gone decimal, and it was, you know, so that would have been, in today's money, probably 10 grand or something.
Right, right.
Yeah. My dad lent me the money.
Sorry, where did the look of Split Enz come from? Because at one stage you were fabulous looking, just sort of extraordinary, eccentric stuff.
Yeah, we had a guy in the band called Noel Crombie who was, he went to art school, and he had a good understanding of 20th century art and design and that. So he started playing with the idea of the suit, because in those days, in the 70s, men wore suits all the time still.
Yeah.
And hats, you know, and it was very straight and conservative, and so he took his own take on the suit. He'd make, you know, shoulder sizes go differently with different padding, and sleeve lengths different, and buttons off center, and it just went from there, and it became more and more distorted. But it had a very strong aesthetic, and it was definitely informed by artists, like Mondrian and I guess Picasso and Salvador Dali and various people that they all loved. And he and Phil Judd, who I started the band with, were both artists in their own right. So, and he would make the clothes as well. So he'd draw them up, beautiful drawings, I remember, and then he'd actually sit down with a sewing machine and make them.
Cool.
And so they're pretty rudimentary. That was like elastic waist, no fly. But, you wouldn't know that because once you got your jacket on, they looked like really cool trousers, but they were pretty rudimentary. And it was all down to the shoes as well. The shoes had to be exactly right. Everything had to look exactly right. And he would give us haircuts. He'd be cutting out shapes in our hair. From about 74 onwards, we were cutting out areas of our heads for sort of some kind of asymmetry. He would sit there and tease it up into peaks and wings and various things, and then probably flood us with hairspray. So I don't know what damage it did. It may have done a lot of it.
There wasn't a lot of that. Yeah, that would have stood out in 1974, wouldn't it? There wasn't a lot of that going on.
Absolutely. I mean, it stood out when we came to England too, but the thing was that, it was like a piece of organic sculpture, really, and we'd all get ready, and then we'd be checking each other out, and it was just like one thing with sort of 14 legs, or however many people were in the band at that time. We felt so good about it, and we'd come on stage and deliver, and that's how I learned to be on stage, was really kind of that alter ego thing,
Yeah.
And, so yeah, it was great. And we came to England in '76, and Phil Manzanera was going to produce our album, and he said, "There's a hole over here you could drive a truck through." In his mind, there was nothing going on. Early Roxy Music was a band that we loved. They'd sort of come, and that people were getting used to them by now. And Bowie was around, and there was definitely some good stuff, but there was a lot of stuff that none of us liked, and Phil wasn't that into it. He just saw it as being, just come on in, boys, And for about a year or so, it was like that. Everybody loved us, the press, and we were playing some really, really great shows. But that was right just before punk, And weirdly enough, we stayed on King's Road in Chelsea. We were put up in these apartments when we first got there, and we were right opposite what was called Sex at that point.
Yeah.
And so we'd be going in there and checking them out, and they'd be checking us out, and it was an interesting time.
Didn't you end up living in Palmer's Green?
Yes, I did. That was quite a bit later.
Same road as I lived in. I only found out later. Yes.
What was the name of the street?
Sorry?
What was the name of the street? Because I'm going to look it up.
Wait, well, I don't know what number you are. Osborne Road. Osborne Road was the name of the street. I'm pretty sure. I think Neil told me this years later, that you'd lived in the same street.
Well, I want to Google it, because I was looking at Palmer's Green, funnily enough, just the other night, going, where did I used to live? It's such a bizarre, like so long ago now, but we lived up. I was living with a young woman above a Turkish couple. So we had the upstairs. We had a bedroom and a kitchen and a living room and a toilet, and then they basically owned the whole house. It was just one of those,
Yeah.
And that's where I wrote songs like Icy Red and lots of other songs. It was a very fertile period, but
well, there ought to be a blue plaque, as we have over here. Key moments in the career of Tim Finn took place in Osborne Road, Palmer's Green. So there you are. You can look that up at your leisure. But you say you work with Phil Manzanera, and you made a record with Phil Manzanera quite recently, didn't you?
I did. I made two.
Right.
We wrote a whole lot of songs. We were just storming, and it was amazing. It was during lockdowns, and we were sending files back and forth. And he knows so many musicians. I think at one stage we had 20 musicians in about 12 different countries working on the album, and it was just an absolute dream, really, to be working with Phil again. I just said to him, it was as lockdown kicked in, I said, "Have you got any Latin grooves that I can write a song over?" And he started to send me little grooves and guitar, and then he was writing chords and melodies, and then all of a sudden we were just away, Yeah.
So is any of that work, does any of that work take place in real time, or is it just people sending, here's an idea and you listen to it and you see if you can add something to it?
That's what it is. Yeah, it's not real time.
No, right.
It's the opposite of sitting in a room and jamming with someone, but It's quite magical, and I love it because you get your file like from England. I'd get up in the morning and there'd be something there from Phil, and I'd work on it during the day at my own pace and whenever I felt like it, and then I'd send it back to him, and then he'd get up and there it would be waiting for him, and then I'd get a lovely email, and it was just a back and forth and an invisible kind of process that didn't have any social niceties or anything about egos or anything. I think it's great. It's I've done a lot of the other kind, and so it's kind of very fresh for me to do it this way, and I think a lot of musicians are enjoying it.
Oh, really? Right. So this record, which I've got here, your record, Do It with Andy White, is this the very belated follow-up to this record, which, as far as I can see, came out in 1996? Is that right?
Yeah, it's a 20. Is that 20? How many years would that be? 26 years ago.
Actually. Yeah.
That was the band was called ALT, isn't there? There was Andy White. Was it Liam from the Hot House Flowers?
Yes.
And you, wasn't it?
Yes.
So Liam's not part of this project, obviously.
No, well, we tried to get him on it, but because he did this interview in Ireland where he was talking about, he's reminiscing about the three of us. We had a great friendship in the 90s in Dublin. I went across there for the first time ever when I was just turned 40, and they were both about in their early 30s, I think, and I was 40, and we became very close friends. We started writing songs, and so many years later, like 2 years back or whenever it was, Liam did an interview, and he was asked about it, and he said, "Oh, the sea holds the memory." It was a classic Liam O'Moyney quote, and beautiful. And so I started writing a song using that, sent it to Andy, and off we went. And so even though Liam didn't choose to be part of it, because he said that he falls at the first hurdle when it comes to home recording. It doesn't work for him. And I used to be a bit like that, but actually I wish you would try it because it's easier than you think, and it's quite nice to record in your own house. But anyway, he was with us in spirit, and he was our muse, if you like. And on we went. Yeah.
So where's Andy? Is Andy in Europe or?
He lives in Melbourne.
Right.
He fell in love with Australia when we did an alt tour of Australia. We recorded our first album there back in 96 or whenever it was, 95 I think. And he just fell in love with the place. So he's lived there ever since. But he's from Belfast originally, and he still tours in Europe and England, I think.
Yeah.
Once every 2 years, yeah.
So this is not under the name of Alt. This is under your individuals' names.
Well, we call our project AT.
All right. Oh, I see. Okay.
Or AT, whichever you prefer. Or
all right. Okay.
And that sort of weirdly Celtic sort of symbol. I say Celtic. I don't actually know. Andy's son Sebastian came up with it. It's lovely. That's obviously the AT.
Yeah.
It's just a play on that idea for those who remember alt. That we are alt without the L. So it's meant, I guess, in a humorous way. It's a reference to that original time. But we did find the songs came really easily and really well for us. So.
Oh, it's a lovely record. It's got a slightly kind of pastoral feel about it, not just because there's a track called Three Sheep Grazing. But what aspects of it are you most pleased with?
Well, I love that song, actually.
It's really good.
There's a few on there. I mean, because it gets quite rocky in places. There's the Happiness Index, which was a song that came from the idea of, the King of Bhutan. He came up with this idea for a happiness index quite a few years back. And his idea is we examine ourselves. We figure out, is our country happy? Are our people happy? Because they're a Buddhist nation. So it's all about looking in, And of course, the Western world grabs hold of it and turns it into a global competition. And so now it's like, well, who's the happiest? Finland, always.
Yes.
And poor old Chad in Africa is down at the bottom, and it just seems so unfair. Yeah. And so we're just taking the piss out of that, the way that all turned out in a way. But yeah, there was some good themes we were exploring and just telling stories to each other. And Three Sheep Grazing was just based on an email that Andy sent me. A friend of his had bemoaned the lack of the commons, that used to bring the village together, and there was a couple of sheep down one end, and it was all nicely balanced.
So I'm interested in this idea of your communicating, doing this work across thousands of miles and not having any personal friction. So if somebody suggests something or sends through a track that somebody doesn't think is all that wonderful, do they just not mention it?
You just don't.
Yeah.
Nothing happens.
Just pretend. Clearly that didn't land very well.
That went into my spam folder.
There's no band meeting. There's no, resentment or we're going to have a meeting. Actually, I'm just reading the Beatles Get Back book because we've all seen Peter Jackson's Wonderful Film by now, but there's now a book, and I went, I don't, as much as I love the Beatles, I don't know if I need to read this book. Oh, I loved it, of course. I couldn't stop reading.
Yeah.
And they were it's so funny with bands because they're all the same. They have meetings, nothing gets decided. The truth is never said. And then you go on and make hopefully a brilliant song using all that energy and conflict. And then you have another meeting and nothing's ever decided. And it goes on after the band's broken up. For decades, it never resolves. It's so funny.
Do you think it's the case? You've had a lot of experience with bands and on your own. If you watch Get Back, what you always feel is, well, Paul McCartney is kind of the leader of this, but he can't say so. And is there always an unspoken leader?
Well, you do feel for George because John and Paul both were so dominant in their songwriting and usually in the conversation. So John would be, I guess he used to throw in deflections and absurdities quite often and get Paul laughing, or Paul would try and match him in that. He was never quite as good at it, but he'd go there because he wanted John to do more of that, and so there was just that thing between the two of them all the time. And Ringo was an essential member of the band because he didn't say a whole lot, but I reckon they all deferred to him in some weird kind of way. So I don't know if they had a leader. Because George had been over jamming with Bob Dylan and that, and he was just off on another tangent, on another journey altogether. Out of necessity. He had to, there was just it was an impasse. There was no way through for all his songs and all his. So, I'm blathering on, but I don't know if Paul was a leader. He certainly comes over very well, and I was pleased for him in the Get Back thing because I'm sure he was nervous about watching it. In fact, he said he was because he came off not that well because they made such a feature of his the little tizzy that he had with George, in the original Let It Be. But when you see him, the songs are pouring out of him. And I love that scene where Ringo's watching him play and he's playing Let It Be and Long and Winding Road. He's just, they're just pouring out of his fingertips and Ringo's just loving every second of it, just being in the room with him. I think all good bands, they have admiration for each other that cuts through all the friction.
Well, the bit where he's writing Get Back, apparently spontaneously out of thin air. And George is just sitting there yawning and looking at his watch. And Ringo starts clapping and singing, Get Back, Get Back. And you think, that is wonderful. Without that, there might not have been a song.
It's the yawning, the occasional yawn that is fascinating.
It's so good.
When they're playing Let It Be, and you feel like saying, stop yawning, it's Let It Be, for crying out.
Yeah, I know. We know how this is going to turn out. You don't, but we do.
I know.
Oh, God.
And then you think they're all about 28, I suppose. 28.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's an interesting age, for all of us, I think,
Yeah.
It's quite a difficult age because
So with this record, is there going to be anything further with this record? Or you're not going to be playing live, I suppose?
Well, I don't think so, but it's possible. But it would be a very stripped back kind of acoustic show maybe sometime. But I'm not that keen on traveling. I've gone a bit like Ringo now. I don't really want to go anywhere.
Really?
Now that I've discovered you can do it all from home.
Exactly, you can do it all without any band meetings and without having to be diplomatic all the time. Exactly.
Yeah, but I would love to play with Andy and with Liam again. Really, we did some amazing shows together as alt, and there's something special between us, so who knows.
What about other stuff that you're doing?
Well, I'm working on another album with ex keyboard player from Split Enz, Eddie Cochran. We've got a project called Forensics, and what we did was we went back to, because when we were making the album with Phil Manzanera at Basing Street Studios, down below in the basement was Bob Marley making Exodus. Right. We didn't know anything about reggae music at the time, but I remember we were quite impressed with the bass on that. You could hear it coming through the floor.
I bet you
wow.
could.
Incredible.
But, while we were doing that, Brian Eno wandered in one day because he, Roxy Music Connection, and Phil must have said, why don't you come down and check out these New Zealand guys? And he doesn't remember it. In fact, I think he says it didn't happen because Phil asked him, but Phil remembers him saying something about there was one section of one of our songs, because our songs were very complex. And Eno was going towards minimalism, and we were kind of very much maximalism. So every few bars we would change, And so he mentioned one bit, and that was 47 years ago, and I've always remembered it. And so I said to Eddie Rayner, the keyboard player, I said, why don't we try and write a new song over that bit? And so he looped that bit, and we wrote a whole new song over it. And it was so exciting. We started digging into the Split Enz kind of archives and finding bits, like I'm talking a few bars,
right,
and writing new songs over it. And it was just a wonderful kind of free-form experiment. So we're doing another one of those.
Very good, very good. So the way we traditionally wrap up these chats is asking us people to tell us what is the greatest record ever made, because we're embarked on a long quest to find out the answer, and we haven't found out the answer so far. But Tim Finn may have it.
A single, it could be an album. There is no wrong answer.
Yep. Well, I'm going to nominate the double A side, Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane.
Okay.
I just don't think it gets any better, and the contrast also between the two is just so brilliantly achieved. And I would love to have a copy of that. Actually, I'm sure you could get it online or whatever. I don't know, but it'd be nice to have that vinyl double A side.
Yes,
masterpiece, a double masterpiece.
It is, absolutely. And that's a pretty fair nomination. Well, look, nice to talk to you. And
you too.
Good luck with the album, as they used to say in the old days of going out into the world and talking to radio stations.
Yeah, come back and tell us all about it. Patting the cushion on their chat show sofa.